Captain Sarah Chen walked through the empty airport terminal at 5 in the morning. Her footsteps echoed in the quiet hallways as she made her way to the crew lounge. She had been flying commercial jets for 15 years and had never been late for a flight. Other pilots called her the Iron Lady because she never made mistakes and always followed every safety rule perfectly. Sarah loved flying more than anything else in the world. When she was 8 years old, her father took her to an air show where she saw jets dancing in the sky like silver birds. That day, she decided she would become a pilot. She worked harder than anyone else to achieve her dream. She studied for countless hours, practiced in flight simulators until her eyes hurt, and saved every penny to pay for flying lessons. Now at 38 years old, Sarah was one of the most respected pilots at Phoenix Airlines. She had flown over 2 million miles without a single accident or safety violation. Her colleagues trusted her completely, and passengers felt safe when they learned Captain Chen was flying their plane. She had perfect vision, steady hands, and a mind that could calculate flight paths faster than most computers. This Tuesday morning felt different, though. Sarah had woken up with a strange feeling in her stomach. She could not explain why, but something felt wrong. She had learned over the years to trust her instincts. Good pilots developed a sixth sense about danger, and her inner voice was whispering warnings she could not ignore. Sarah entered the crew briefing room where she met her co-pilot, David Martinez. David was a cheerful young man who had been flying for only 3 years. He looked up to Sarah and often asked her for advice about handling difficult situations. They reviewed their flight plan together. Flight 447 would take them from Phoenix to Chicago with 312 passengers on board. The weather looked good, and the flight should take about 3 hours. After the briefing, Sarah walked out to the tarmac to inspect their aircraft. This was something she did before every flight, even though airplane mechanics had already checked everything. She believed that, as the captain, she was responsible for every person who trusted her with their lives. She would never take shortcuts when it came to safety. The morning air was cold and crisp. Sarah could see her breath as she walked around the large Boeing jet. The plane looked beautiful in the early morning light. Its white body gleamed, and the engines appeared powerful and ready. She began her inspection at the nose and worked her way back, checking every detail she could see. Everything looked normal until she reached the left engine. Sarah climbed up on a maintenance ladder to get a closer look at the engine bolts. These bolts were crucial because they held the massive jet engine to the wing. If they failed during flight, the engine could tear away from the plane, causing a catastrophic crash. Sarah had inspected thousands of engine bolts over her career. She knew exactly how they should look, feel, and even smell. The standard bolts were made of titanium, an incredibly strong metal that could withstand enormous pressure and temperature changes. They had a specific weight, color, and texture that experienced pilots could recognize immediately, but these bolts looked different. They appeared lighter in color and seemed to have a different surface texture. When Sarah touched one of the bolts, she felt her heart skip a beat. The metal felt wrong. It was not as heavy as it should be, and when she pressed her fingernail against it, tiny metal flakes came off in her hand. Sarah felt a chill run down her spine that had nothing to do with the cold morning air. She had never seen anything like this before. These bolts looked like cheap imitations of the real titanium bolts that should be holding this engine in place. She examined several more bolts and found the same problem with all of them. Her mind began racing with terrifying possibilities. If these bolts were fake or made of inferior metal, they could fail at any moment during flight. The engine weighs several tons. And at 35,000 feet, the forces acting on these bolts are enormous. If even one bolt failed, it could start a chain reaction that would tear the engine away from the wing. Sarah thought about the 312 people who would board this plane in 2 hours. There would be families going on vacation, business people traveling to important meetings, and children visiting their grandparents. All of these innocent people were trusting her to keep them safe. How could she put them at risk by flying an aircraft with questionable engine bolts? She climbed down from the ladder and immediately called her supervisor, Mike Rodriguez. Mike had been working at Phoenix Airlines for 20 years and was known for his no-nonsense approach to airline operations. Sarah explained what she had found and requested that the flight be delayed until the bolts could be properly inspected and replaced if necessary. Mike's response shocked her. Instead of thanking her for catching a potential safety problem, he sounded annoyed and impatient. He told her that the bolts were fine and that she was being overly cautious. He reminded her that delaying flights cost the airline thousands of dollars and could affect her performance reviews. When Sarah insisted that the bolts needed to be examined by a qualified mechanic, Mike's tone became cold and threatening. He reminded her about her monthly mortgage payments, her daughter Emma's college tuition that was due next month, and how difficult it would be for a pilot her age to find another job if she developed a reputation for being difficult. Sarah felt like she had been punched in the stomach. She had always believed that airline safety was the top priority, but Mike was clearly more concerned about money and schedules than passenger lives. She realized that she was facing an impossible choice between her conscience and her career. Standing, alone on the cold tarmac, looking up at the questionable engine bolts, Sarah knew that her perfect world was about to crumble. She had always been the pilot everyone could count on, but now she was being asked to count on bolts that might not hold together at 35,000 feet. The weight of 312 lives suddenly felt heavier than any airplane she had ever flown. Sarah could not sleep that night. She kept thinking about those strange bolts and Mike's threatening words. Every time she closed her eyes, she imagined Flight 447 falling from the sky with pieces of the engine scattered across the ground below. She decided she had to investigate further, even if it meant risking her job. The next morning, Sarah arrived at the airport 2 hours early. She told the security guard she needed to do some extra paperwork, but her real plan was to examine other aircraft in the Phoenix Airlines fleet. She wanted to know if the problem was limited to just one plane or if it was more widespread. Sarah started with the planes parked closest to the terminal. She climbed up maintenance ladders and crawled under wings, checking engine bolts, brake, systems, and other critical components. What she discovered made her feel sick to her stomach. Nearly every aircraft had the same cheap-looking bolts she had found on Flight 447. On one plane, she found engine mounts that had small cracks running through them. These mounts were supposed to hold engines weighing several tons, but they looked like they might break apart under normal flight conditions. On another aircraft, she discovered brake pads that were worn down to dangerous levels. The metal backing was showing through, which meant the brakes could fail completely during landing. Sarah took photographs with her phone, trying to document everything she was finding. She measured bolt dimensions and noted serial numbers on suspicious parts. She was building a case, though she was not sure yet what she would do with the evidence. As she continued her investigation, Sarah noticed that she was not alone. Security guards began following her around the hangar. At first, she thought it was just a coincidence, but the same two men appeared wherever she went. When she moved to a different area, they moved too. When she stopped to examine something, they stopped and watched her. Sarah also discovered something disturbing about the source of these questionable parts. She found shipping labels and invoices that showed most of the aircraft components were coming from a company called Superior Aircraft Components. The company was owned by a man named Robert Kane, and his business address was in a small industrial park outside the city. What made Sarah suspicious was the price difference. When she compared invoices from Superior Aircraft Components to bills from other parts suppliers, she found that Kane's company was charging 70% less than the standard market price. This was impossible unless the parts were either stolen, used, or made from inferior materials. Sarah tried to research Superior Aircraft Components online, but she found very little information about the company. They had a simple website with no details about their manufacturing processes or quality certifications. There were no customer reviews or industry ratings. For a company supplying critical aircraft parts to major airlines, this lack of information was very suspicious. When Sarah tried to discuss her findings with other pilots, she discovered that asking questions about aircraft safety was not welcome at Phoenix Airlines. Pilots who had worked there for many years told her quietly that raising concerns about maintenance issues was a quick way to end up unemployed and blacklisted from the aviation industry. One veteran pilot named Captain Jim Walsh pulled Sarah aside and warned her to be careful. He told her that 2 years earlier, another pilot had complained about similar problems with aircraft parts. That pilot was fired within a week for supposedly failing a routine medical exam, even though he had passed the same exam just 6 months before. Sarah realized she was dealing with something much bigger and more dangerous than just a few bad bolts. There seemed to be an organized effort to cover up the use of substandard aircraft parts, and anyone who tried to expose the truth faced serious consequences. The pressure on Sarah increased when she received a phone call at home that evening. A man with a deep, gravelly voice told her that she should stop asking questions about things that did not concern her. He knew her home address, her daughter Emma's school schedule, and even what time she usually went grocery shopping on weekends. The caller told Sarah that accidents could happen to people who did not mind their own business. He mentioned that it would be terrible if something happened to Emma while she was walking home from school, or if Sarah's house caught fire while she was sleeping. The message was clear: stop investigating or face the consequences. Sarah's hands were shaking when she hung up the phone. She had never been threatened before, and the experience terrified her. But instead of backing down, the threats made her more determined to uncover the truth. She realized that if criminals were willing to threaten her family to keep this conspiracy secret, then the danger to airline passengers must be even greater than she had imagined. That night, Sarah sat at her kitchen table and made a list of everything she knew so far. Substandard aircraft parts were being installed on commercial jets. The parts were coming from a suspicious company with no legitimate credentials. Airline management was aware of the problem, but was covering it up. Anyone who tried to expose the truth was being silenced through threats or job termination. Sarah knew she was at a crossroads. She could forget what she had discovered, keep flying, and hope that nothing terrible happened. Or she could continue investigating and risk losing everything she had worked for, including potentially putting her family in danger. Looking at a photograph of Emma on her refrigerator, Sarah made her decision. She would continue fighting, no matter what it cost her personally. Too many innocent lives were at stake to walk away now. Sarah knew she could not fight this battle alone. She needed someone who understood aircraft maintenance and could help her gather more evidence. After thinking carefully about who she could trust, Sarah decided to approach Jack Morrison, a senior. aircraft mechanic who had worked at Phoenix Airlines for 20 years. Jack was known for his honesty and attention to detail. Other mechanics respected him, and pilots trusted his work completely. Sarah had always noticed that planes maintained by Jack never had mysterious problems or unexpected breakdowns. If anyone would care about passenger safety over company profits, it would be Jack. Sarah found Jack in the maintenance hangar on Thursday morning. He was working alone on a hydraulic system, and Sarah waited until no one else was around before approaching him. She told Jack about the suspicious bolts she had discovered and asked if he had noticed anything unusual about the parts being installed on Phoenix Airlines aircraft. Jack's face grew serious as Sarah described what she had found. He sat down his tools and looked around to make sure no one was listening. Then he told Sarah something that made her blood run cold. He had been noticing problems with aircraft parts for months, but had been too afraid to speak up about it. Jack explained that Superior Aircraft Components had become the primary supplier for Phoenix Airlines about 18 months earlier. Shortly after that, he began seeing parts that did not meet the usual quality standards. Bolts that were too soft, brake pads that wore out too quickly, and hydraulic seals that leaked after just a few flights. When Jack had tried to report these problems to his supervisor, he was told that the parts met minimum federal requirements and that questioning company suppliers was not part of his job. He was warned that mechanics who caused trouble by rejecting perfectly good parts would find themselves looking for work elsewhere. Jack showed Sarah his maintenance logbook, where he had been secretly documenting problems with Superior aircraft. Components, parts. The evidence was overwhelming. Over the past year, there had been dozens of incidents involving component failures, emergency landings due to mechanical problems, and near misses that were blamed on pilot error rather than equipment failure. Together, Sarah and Jack began collecting more evidence. They photographed suspicious parts, copied maintenance records, and documented safety violations that had been covered up by management. They discovered that Robert Kane's company was not just supplying Phoenix Airlines. Superior Aircraft Components was selling substandard parts to 12 different airlines across the country. The scope of the conspiracy was staggering. Thousands of flights were taking off every day with passengers whose lives depended on cheap, unreliable parts. Kane was making millions of dollars while putting hundreds of thousands of air travelers at risk every single day. Sarah and Jack found evidence that Kane had been bribing maintenance supervisors, safety inspectors, and even some government officials to look the other way. Money was changing hands to ensure that substandard parts would be approved and that anyone who raised questions would be silenced or removed from their position. They also discovered that the fake parts had already caused several accidents that were covered up and blamed on other factors. A plane in Denver had made an emergency landing when an engine mount cracked during takeoff, but the incident report blamed turbulence instead of equipment failure. A flight in Miami had skidded off the runway when its brakes failed, but investigators concluded that the pilot had landed too fast. As Sarah and Jack gathered more evidence, the threats against them escalated dramatically. Sarah arrived at her car one evening to find all 4 tires slashed. A note on her windshield warned her that next time it might be more than just her tires that got cut. Jack found his toolbox filled with dead rats and a message telling him that he would end up the same way if he did not stop asking questions. His locker was broken into and personal items were stolen. Someone had been in his house while he was at work, leaving obvious signs that they had searched through his belongings. Both Sarah and Jack were called into separate meetings with airline management. They were told that their jobs were in jeopardy due to their negative attitudes and disruptive behavior. Management made it clear that employees who could not work as part of the team would be replaced by people who could follow instructions without causing problems. The message was unmistakable. Stop investigating the parts conspiracy or face serious consequences. But Sarah and Jack had already seen too much evidence to turn back now. They knew that if they remained silent, it was only a matter of time before a plane would crash, killing everyone on board. Sarah began having nightmares about aircraft falling from the sky. She would wake up in the middle of the night, covered in sweat, and thinking about all the passengers who were flying at that moment on planes with defective parts. She felt responsible for every person who might die because she had not done enough to stop the conspiracy. Jack was also struggling with the pressure. His wife begged him to drop the investigation and just do his job without making waves. She reminded him that they had a mortgage to pay and children to feed. Losing his job would destroy their family financially, but Jack could not ignore what he knew about the dangerous parts being installed on passenger aircraft. Despite the threats and pressure, Sarah and Jack continued working together to expose the truth. They knew they were running out of time. Every day that passed meant more flights taking off with defective parts and more chances for a catastrophic accident that would kill hundreds of innocent people. Everything changed on Friday morning when Sarah discovered that Flight 739 was scheduled to take off in just 6 hours using an aircraft with severely compromised engine bolts. The plane was supposed to carry 289 passengers, including a group of high school students who were traveling to Washington, D.C. for an educational field trip. Sarah had examined this particular aircraft 2 days earlier and found that several engine bolts were so weak that she could bend them with her bare hands. The metal was clearly not titanium but some cheaper alloy that would never withstand the stresses of commercial flight. She knew that the chances of engine failure during Flight 739 were dangerously high. Sarah immediately tried every official channel she could think of to stop the flight. She called the Federal Aviation Administration and spoke to a safety inspector, who told her that her complaint would be investigated within 30 days. When Sarah explained that the flight was leaving in 6 hours, the inspector said that emergency procedures required more documentation than she could provide over the phone. Sarah contacted the airline's safety department and spoke to the director of flight operations. He listened to her concerns but dismissed them as the paranoid worries of a pilot who was under too much stress. He suggested that Sarah take some time off to get her mental health checked and reminded her that making false safety reports was a serious offense that could result in criminal charges. Desperate for help, Sarah tried calling local television stations and newspapers. She spoke to 3 different reporters, but they all told her the same thing. They needed more concrete proof before they could run such a serious story. Accusations against airlines required extensive verification and legal review that would take weeks or months to complete. With time running out and no official help available, Sarah realized she would have to take matters into her own hands. She made the most difficult decision of her career. She would steal the official maintenance records that would prove the conspiracy existed, even though taking them would be a federal crime that could send her to prison for years. Sarah knew that without absolute proof, no one would believe her story about the parts conspiracy. Flight 739 would take off with passengers who had no idea they were flying in an aircraft that could fall apart at any moment. She could not live with herself if she let that happen without doing everything possible to prevent it. Jack agreed to help her break into the maintenance office, even though he was also risking his freedom and his family's future. They planned to enter the building at 2 in the morning when security would be lightest and most of the airport would be empty. Sarah spent Friday evening with her daughter Emma, trying to act normal while her heart was breaking. She helped Emma with homework, made dinner, and watched a movie together. All the while, Sarah was thinking that this might be the last normal evening she would ever spend with her daughter. If Sarah was caught stealing the maintenance records, she would go to prison. Even if she was not caught, exposing the conspiracy would certainly end her career and make her a target for Kane's criminal organization. She was about to sacrifice everything she had worked for in order to save the lives of people she had never met. At midnight, Sarah kissed Emma goodnight and told her how much she loved her. Emma asked why her mother seemed so sad, and Sarah said she was just tired from work. She promised Emma that everything would be okay, even though she was not sure she believed it herself. Sarah met Jack in the airport parking lot at 1:30 in the morning. They both looked scared but determined. Jack had brought tools that would help them get into the maintenance office, and Sarah had prepared a list of the specific documents they needed to find. They entered the airport through a service entrance that Jack had access to as a mechanic. The empty terminals felt eerie and threatening as they made their way through dark corridors toward the maintenance offices. Every shadow seemed to hide a security guard, and every sound made them freeze with fear. When they reached the maintenance office, Jack used his tools to quietly open the locked door. Inside, they found filing cabinets full of documents that would prove the extent of the parts conspiracy. Sarah's hands shook as she photographed maintenance records, invoices from Superior Aircraft Components, and emails between airline executives, discussing how to hide the use of substandard parts. They found evidence that Robert Kane had paid over $2 million in bribes to airline officials over the past 2 years. They discovered that Kane's company had been selling fake parts to airlines across the country, putting millions of passengers at risk. Most importantly, they found documentation proving that Flight 739's aircraft had known defects that made it unsafe to fly. As Sarah and Jack copied the last of the documents, they heard footsteps in the hallway outside. Someone was coming toward the maintenance office, and they had nowhere to hide. They quickly gathered their evidence and prepared for the worst, knowing that their fight to expose the truth was about to become much more dangerous. Sarah and Jack held their breath as the footsteps in the hallway grew closer. They crouched behind a desk, clutching the stolen documents that could save hundreds of lives or send them both to prison. The footsteps stopped right outside the maintenance office door, and Sarah was sure they were about to be caught. After what felt like hours but was probably only minutes, the footsteps continued down the hallway and faded away. It had been a security guard making his regular rounds, but he had not noticed that the office door was unlocked. Sarah and Jack waited another 10 minutes before carefully leaving the building with their precious evidence. With the stolen documents in hand, Sarah knew she needed to contact someone who could help her expose the conspiracy quickly. She had heard about Jennifer Walsh, an investigative reporter who worked for a major news website and was known for exposing corporate corruption. Jennifer had won awards for her stories about companies that put profits ahead of public safety. Sarah called Jennifer at 3 in the morning, waking her up to explain the urgent situation. At first, Jennifer was skeptical about talking to a stranger who claimed to have evidence of a massive airline conspiracy. But when Sarah described what she had found and mentioned that a flight with 289 passengers was scheduled to take off in just 3 hours, Jennifer agreed to meet immediately. They met at an all-night diner near the airport, where Sarah spread the stolen documents across a booth table. Jennifer's eyes grew wide as she looked through the evidence. Falsified safety reports, records of bribes paid to inspectors, emails between Kane and airline executives discussing how to hide the use of dangerous parts, and maintenance logs showing that Flight 739's aircraft had known defects. Jennifer realized immediately that this was the biggest aviation safety scandal in decades. She called her editor and began writing the story while Sarah raced back to the airport. Sarah's plan was simple but risky. She would refuse to allow Flight 739 to take off by any means necessary, even if it meant physically blocking the aircraft, or chaining herself to the landing gear. Sarah was prepared to be arrested, fired, and prosecuted as long as those 289 passengers stayed safe. She knew that once Jennifer's story was published online, there would be no turning back. Her career would be over, but hopefully the public pressure would force airlines to ground their fleets and replace all the dangerous parts. At the airport, Sarah went directly to the gate where Flight 739 passengers were beginning to board. She tried to speak to the gate agent about safety concerns, but was told that only authorized personnel could make decisions about flight operations. When Sarah identified herself as a Phoenix Airlines pilot, the gate agent called security to have her removed from the area. Sarah then went to the tarmac where Flight 739's aircraft was being prepared for departure. She climbed onto a baggage cart and began shouting to anyone who would listen that the plane was not safe to fly. Ground crew workers stared at her in confusion, and airport security guards came running from all directions. At exactly the same moment, Jennifer's story went live on the news website. The headline read, "Deadly Aircraft Parts Conspiracy Exposed, Millions of Passengers at Risk." Within minutes, the article was being shared thousands of times on social media platforms, and other news organizations began picking up the story. Chaos erupted at the airport as passengers began demanding answers about their flight safety. People in the Flight 739 boarding area could see Sarah on the tarmac through the terminal windows, and some began recording videos with their phones. The videos immediately went viral on the internet, showing a pilot desperately trying to prevent a dangerous flight from taking off. Airport security surrounded Sarah, but she held up her phone showing Jennifer's article that was now making national news. She shouted that the plane was not safe and that the passengers needed to be evacuated immediately. Some passengers on Flight 739 could hear the commotion and began asking flight attendants what was happening. The airline's executives went into full panic mode, trying to control the damage while Sarah stood her ground on the tarmac. They ordered security to arrest her for trespassing and disrupting flight operations, but the officers hesitated because news cameras had arrived and were broadcasting everything live on television. Within an hour, Flight 739 was officially canceled due to mechanical concerns, and passengers were told they would be rebooked on other flights after additional safety inspections. Sarah was arrested and taken to jail, but she felt victorious knowing that 289 people would not be flying on an aircraft with defective parts. The story exploded across every major news network in America. Social media was flooded with discussions about airline safety and corporate corruption. Passengers began demanding that airlines prove their aircraft were safe before they would agree to fly. Stock prices for Phoenix Airlines and other carriers plummeted as investors panicked about potential lawsuits and government investigations. Sarah spent the night in a jail cell, charged with theft of company documents, trespassing, and sabotaging flight operations. She faced the possibility of years in prison, but she had no regrets about her actions. She had prevented what could have been a catastrophic airline disaster, and the truth about the parts conspiracy was finally being exposed to the world. The scandal that Sarah exposed grew bigger with each passing hour. Major news networks assigned their best investigative teams to the story, and within 24 hours, Federal investigators were swarming Phoenix Airlines headquarters and Robert Kane's parts manufacturing facility. The FBI executed search warrants and began seizing documents and computer files as evidence. Robert Kane was arrested at his home while trying to destroy financial records that showed the extent of his criminal enterprise. FBI agents also arrested 12 airline executives, including Sarah's supervisor Mike Rodriguez, on charges of conspiracy, fraud, and willfully endangering public safety. The evidence Sarah and Jack had gathered proved that these men had knowingly put passengers at risk to increase company profits. Phoenix Airlines was forced to ground its entire fleet of aircraft for emergency safety inspections. Every plane had to be examined by independent mechanics who were not employed by the airline. The inspections revealed that the problem was even worse than Sarah had imagined. Over 80% of the airline's aircraft had substandard parts that needed immediate replacement. Sarah faced serious legal consequences for her actions. Phoenix Airlines filed criminal charges against her for theft of company documents and sabotaging flight operations. The company's lawyers argued that Sarah had committed serious crimes and should be prosecuted to the full extent of the law. She was released from jail on bond, but faced the possibility of spending several years in prison. However, public opinion was firmly on Sarah's side. People across the country saw her as a hero who had risked everything to save lives. A crowdfunding campaign was started to help pay for her legal defense, and within a week, over $500,000 had been donated by supporters who admired her courage. Major news networks interviewed Sarah as the pilot who had prevented one of the worst aviation disasters in American history. Aviation safety organizations gave her awards for courage and integrity. Most importantly, the government investigation confirmed that her actions had been completely justified by the imminent danger to passenger safety. The federal investigation revealed shocking details about the scope of Kane's criminal operation. His company had been selling fake aircraft parts to airlines across the country for over 3 years. Investigators found that Superior Aircraft components had manufactured parts using cheap metals that were painted and marked to look like genuine titanium components. Emergency inspections of aircraft nationwide found critical failures in over 2,000 planes. 89 aircraft were discovered to have defects so serious that they could have caused catastrophic crashes at any moment. Airlines were forced to spend billions of dollars replacing substandard parts and implementing new safety protocols to prevent similar problems in the future. The human cost of Kane's conspiracy became clear when investigators reviewed accident reports from the past 3 years. Several minor crashes and emergency landings that had been blamed on pilot error were actually caused by the failure of fake parts. Passengers had been injured, and it was only by luck that no major disasters had occurred before Sarah exposed the truth. In the end, Sarah was cleared of all criminal charges when federal prosecutors determined that her actions had been justified by the imminent danger to passenger safety. The judge who reviewed her case said that Sarah had acted with extraordinary courage, and that her decision to break the law had prevented a tragedy that could have killed hundreds of innocent people. Job offers poured in from airlines around the world who wanted to hire a pilot with such uncompromising dedication to safety. Sarah chose to accept a position with a small charter airline where she could personally inspect every aircraft she flew. She also became a consultant who helped other airlines improve their safety procedures and parts procurement processes. Robert Kane was sentenced to 25 years in federal prison and ordered to pay over $2 billion in restitution to airlines and passengers who had been affected by his criminal scheme. The corrupted airline executives received sentences ranging from 5 to 15 years in prison. Mike Rodriguez, who had threatened Sarah's job when she first discovered the problem, was sentenced to 8 years for his role in the conspiracy. New federal laws were passed requiring independent verification of all aircraft parts and creating stronger protections for whistleblowers in the aviation industry. The Sarah Chen Aviation Safety Act made it illegal for airlines to retaliate against employees who report legitimate safety concerns, and it established substantial financial rewards for people who expose aviation safety violations. Sarah Chen became a symbol of courage in the face of corporate corruption. Her story inspired other aviation workers to report safety violations without fear of losing their jobs. She proved that sometimes one person's brave decision to do the right thing can save thousands of lives and change an entire industry for the better. Years later, when Sarah looked back on that terrifying night when she stole the maintenance records, she knew she had made the right choice. The investigation that followed her actions led to the safest period in commercial aviation history. Millions of passengers were flying on aircraft that were safer because of the reforms that resulted from her courage. Sarah's daughter Emma grew up to become an aerospace engineer, inspired by her mother's dedication to aviation safety. Emma often told people that her mother had taught her that doing the right thing was more important than doing the easy thing, and that sometimes one person really could make a difference in the world.